right, everyone, welcome to the ABCs of Bike Maintenance. Stands for Air, Brakes, and Chain. My name is Galen Mook. I'm the Executive Director of Mass Bike, or the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition. We do statewide bicycle advocacy, which means we deal with a lot of broad topics of funding and legislation, and general policies that help out for engineering, education, enforcement, evaluation, and all of the E's that fit with bicycle advocacy. One of the big ones, of course, is the equity E. It's a lens with which we view all of our advocacy efforts. So especially pertinent as the social unrest is kind of coming to a forefront in our country, we want to focus on how we can benefit everybody, especially those who are traditionally left out of some of these conversations. So feel free to chime in on any of those E's, including the equity E on the chat. This could be kind of a more freewheeling conversation, judging that we only have about 12 people with us, which is great, but that allows us for a little more intimate conversation as well. I do want to focus on mechanics the best as possible, but I understand there might be some questions about how to ride, how to feel safe out there, best practices, best routes, even stuff like bike sizing, bike types, bike clothing. I can generally be a resource, or if I can't try to answer some questions now, I can also do some follow-ups. For those of you unfamiliar with what Mass Bike does, you can also check out massbike.org. We do your statewide view, but it does come down to the local level. So personally, I live in Allston, which is just the neighborhood in the west side of Boston. But one of my favorite trips is to head up and do the whole Cape Ann loop. Generally, I used to take the train up to Beverly and skip all the mess between Boston and Salem, hop off the train with my bike and ride the lovely rolling hills and some of the dirt paths and some of the woods paths in your neck of the woods if you're actually from the Hamilton-Wenham area. Where was I last? I guess it was last fall in November. I went up to the Russell Orchard's Apple and Wine Festival in Ipswich, and I rode through Hamilton-Wenham, which was lovely, of course, one of my favorite rides, and stopped over at the polo courts and got to watch the Yale-Harvard women's polo team on horses knock around some balls, and that was really fascinating to be able to see. And kind of the beauty of being able to explore by bike is that you get to see the nuances and the charm of your neighborhoods and your rolling hills and your rural areas and your awesome, lovely wildlife. I also am aware that a lot of you might be attending out of the Hamilton-Wenham area, which is also fantastic. So I welcome everybody if you're coming from the state of anywhere within the state of Massachusetts or beyond. At my last webinar, we had somebody calling in from New York City because they wanted to know about the ABCs as well. So all this stuff is pertinent to all types of riding. A little bit of housekeeping again. You've heard me say this a few times, but we have a chat function in the bottom part of the window. If you go down, if you're new to Zoom, you can go down to the chat button, pop in the chat. Feel free to test it out right now just so you get familiar with it. You can send to panelists, you can send to attendees, but I will be keeping an eye on it the best that I can, knowing that I am a one-man show down here. And again, if you have trouble hearing me or trouble seeing me, please do let me know. I will be keeping an eye on it. Great. Excellent. Thanks, Dean. We got you. Cool. And Lorraine wants to know a little bit of, Dean wants to know a little bit about derailers and indexing. So if I forget to get to that when I'm at my C portion of the chain, please do let me know. And I want to thank, of course, the Hamilton-Wenham Library. It is really tough right now because we can't get together in person. So anything that we can do virtually to build our community, to educate, to encourage, that's where we're at right now. Mass Bike does have a series of webinars. This is the last one for a week, but we'll be jumping back in a week and a half with a webinar on bicycling authors. Then we'll be talking about bicycling law. We'll probably have some bicycle advocacy going on. Anything that you want to know in particular, you can feel free to get in touch with us, and I will put my the bike info at massbike.org in the chat. That was just to panelists. I'm learning Zoom just myself. So to all panelists and attendees, you can always get in touch with me at bikeinfo.org. And I'll put my name here, Galen Mook, and my personal email if you do want to keep in touch as well. It looks like we're at critical capacity, so I'm just going to jump right in. Again, feel free to derail me, but I do have a pretty packed 45 minutes for us. I do want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, but don't wait for the questions. Feel free to pepper them throughout the presentation. Just one last check in my emails to make sure we're all good. And I think we'll start to roll. All right. So again, welcome. I really appreciate you taking the time this evening to join us. Welcome to my bike room, which is actually just my laundry room in my basement. I'm going to do the work on my bike down here right now because I want to limit my capacity and limit my ability to kind of put my bike up on a stand or have a lot of breadth of room, because I realize that a lot of you might not have a real full setup in your house. So everything that we're going to cover today should be able to be done just in your basement, just in your garage. I do realize it's like a lovely 78 degrees outside. So in a perfect world, I would be doing this in person, outdoors, and we get our lovely sunset. But in the meantime, I'm here for you in my basement. So welcome to my bike room. The tools we're going to need today, and I encourage you to follow along at home. So if you want to take a second and going to grab your bike, but what we're going to use a bicycle. Awesome. I have my mountain bike here. We'll go through a little bit of the way the mountain bike might be a little bit different than the bike that you have at home. We're going to need an air pump. This is my floor pump. By that, I mean it sits on the floor and then I pump it up. It's got a very large air chamber, but you can also, if you don't have a floor pump, you might be able to grab a portable pump. This is a small pump, which obviously is a much smaller chamber. I'm not really going to use this one too much because it's a little cumbersome. It's a little tricky to fill a whole tire with this, but know that what we're going to need today is something to fill your bike tires with. So you're going to need an air pump. The next thing we're going to need is some bike chain oil. We call it lubricant. I've got two varieties. I'll see if I can make them a little closer for you. Chain J, which is a little bit of a lighter one. You can see it's kind of the yellow one. It's really thin. And then the thicker, goopier green stuff. Same job. They both work for bike chains, but I only really need one. I'm just showing you a little bit of both. But it'd be good to have a bottle of bike chain lube available for today as well. This is also something that you can do after the fact. I'm recording this, so we'll be able to share it. So no worries if you don't have it right now. But I do like to see step by step. If you're having any troubles, you can tag me in the chat and we can kind of walk through things. And the last thing that I'll ask you to have is a rag. This is going to be used for cleaning off the chain, wiping it down, and cleaning the gunk off the chain and the gears and what's called the derailleur, and making sure that once the chain is greased, that we then wipe it down and make sure it's not too wet. So that said, it's just very simple today. We're going to have air pump, chain lube, and a rag. We could talk about more other tools that might be handy for you to have at home. Is a multi-tool, which is essentially all of the different sizes of Allen wrenches, including some screwdrivers and a little bit more. We're not really going to cover using this, although there might be some things on your bike that are different than mine that require this. But if you don't have it, not a big deal. It's not really going to pertain to what we're going to be talking about this hour. And then, generally good to have are some tire levers. And we're not really going to cover changing a flat. That's a whole hour in itself. But these are really good to have at home if you're ever going to learn how to change your own tire. And these allow you to pry the tire off of the wheel. And then you're going to want a bike tube, like a spare tube that you have at home, which is the proper sizing and the proper valve for your bike. We'll talk about all this stuff about nuances of sizes and valves in types of bike tubes, but these are all generally good to have at home as well. We're going to talk today generally about stuff that you are going to be able to do yourself every single time before you ride. And I really mean every single time before you ride to make sure that your bike is safe to go. And we're going to do the A, B, and C, which stands for air, brakes, and chain. So again, let me just check the chat. Excellent. Nice, Vivienne. I appreciate you chiming in too. So feel free to let me know how you're doing out there. All right. So Let's jump right in. This is my mountain bike. It's a specialized brand. It's a stump jumper. Her name is Stumpy. She's from the mid-90s. And a couple things about this bike. Pardon me here. You can't see just off of frame. I have a whole bunch of stuff I have to mess with. But a couple things about this bike, which might be different than your bike, which matter for the air, the brakes, and the chain. First is the size of the tire. So this is a mountain bike, and by that I mean it's meant for being able to dig into dirt, dig into grass, dig into gravel. So it's got a wider tire, so there's more grip, and it's also got knobs on it. And those knobs allow me to really dig into the ground. You might have a different bike with a skinnier wheel, and that might be a smooth wheel. We call it a hybrid bike or even a road bike, depending on the size and the frame. But the biggest thing to worry about, not worry, but the biggest thing to keep in mind with what we're talking about is how wide my tire is, because that'll change how much air goes into your tire. The wider the tire, the less pressure needed for the air in here. The skinnier the tire, the higher the pressure that you're going to need for your tire. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the biggest thing here with mountain bikes is a wider tire with knobs on it. The next thing to think about are the brakes. Now, the B for brakes on my bike are activated at the handlebar levers. Now, this is just the lever for the brake. The brake itself is actually down on the wheel. And you can see here, we call these rim brakes because the brake that is activated right here is on the rim of the wheel. And by that, I mean when I spin my wheel, you can see the brakes close and it stops my wheel by pushing a little piece of rubber right up against the metal. Other bikes, maybe the bike that you have at home, has a braking system that has a disc brake, which is at the center of the wheel. Obviously, this does not have a disc brake, so my apologies if this is not matching, but we'll still try to cover ways of your B still to match my B. But another thing to think about with this one is my brake levers are flat. And by that, I mean these are mountain bike style, where the handlebars, we call it horizontal. Whereas if you have a road bike, sometimes there's what's called drop bars. So the handlebars drop down. So the brake levers are actually activated here in a vertical position, but mine are in a horizontal position. That doesn't really change what we're going to cover today, but just so you know, there's differences between bikes. We're still going to cover the way that rim brakes work, the way that the rubber works, and the way that the cable is activated and the lever, but you might have a little bit of differences with your bike. You might actually have hydraulic systems in the cable lines, which means that it's full of fluid. We're not really going to cover hydraulic brakes. It's the same type of brakes that cars have and motorcycles have. We're going to be talking about cable pull brakes today, but just so you know that my bike might be a little different than your bike. And the last thing with the C is my chain. You'll see on my chains, I have a full gear system in the back, which means I have a derailleur, which is right back here, multiple gears in the back, and then a choice of gears in the front. And the difference between the gears is it changes the resistance, how hard it is to pedal. I can make it easier or I can make it harder. If I'm going uphill, I want to make it easier. If I'm going downhill, maybe I want to make it harder. And by changing where my chain is sitting on my gears, I can actually change how much, quote, resistance is part of my bike. You might have a bike that only has a single gear, or you might have a bike that has internal gears, in which case you can't really change where the chain is sitting. We're not really going to talk about too much about that, but when we talk about cleaning the chain is still a chain and you're still going to need to clean it. So keep that in mind as well. The last one, I know I said the last before, but the last letter, which I didn't cover quite yet, it's the Q. So we're doing A, B, C, air, brakes, and chain. And there's also a C for a quick check. And the thing about the Q for the quick check is it doesn't necessarily apply to every bike, but I have quick releases on a few parts of my bike which affix and grab the parts and actually attach it to my bike. And if I open up the quick release, like for instance, I'm going to open up the quick release on this seat post here, I can open up this lever. You can see I open it up. Now my seat is wobbly. I'm going to want to make sure that I know how to close with my palm. I'm going to close this down. It's going to feel pretty hard, but it's going to close all the way. Now my seat is stuck on my bike. So again, the quick releases on my bike are on the seat and then down on the wheels. I'll show you my front wheel. I have a quick release lever right here on my front wheel as well. And you can see that if I were to open this quick release lever, now my wheel is wobbly, and that's no good. So I'm going to want to know how to close my quick release lever to make sure that my wheel is actually sturdy and firm on my bike. So the A, the B, the C, and the Q. I'm going to run through the ABC quick check. I'm going to take a pause, and then I'm going to dive into A and B and C. Again, feel free to chime in the chat. I'm going to take some time today to keep an eye on it. All right. So you're going to want to know the ABCs because this is the very basics to make sure that your bike is functional and safe to ride. This is a check I'm going to teach you. It takes about 10 seconds to do, and you're going to want to do it literally every single time before you ride. Even if your bike has been tuned up by a pro mechanic, or even if you've been out riding, you could still get a slow leak and not know that your air is losing out of your tire. Or your brakes might wear down or might get unhooked, and you want to make sure that your brakes are stopping your bike before you're halfway down the hill. And if your chain ever drops, if you've ever had your chain fall off your bike like this, and now you can't ride because your chain isn't on there, I'm going to show you how to reset the chain so that your chain gets back on your bike so that your chain is functional and you can roll. So that's the A, the B, and the C. I'm going to do the ABC check real quick, and this is something I want you to practice at home and make sure that you're covering literally every single time before you ride. So you're going to squeeze the tires, both tires. You have a front tire and a back tire, and you're going to know how hard they feel when they're inflated. If they feel soft, you're going to want to put air in. Next, you're going to want to squeeze the brakes. Just squeeze them pretty hard, make sure that they lock out and that you've got some gap between the brake lever and the handlebar so that you've got some good control. And then once you've locked your brakes out, you're going to rock your bike back and forth to make sure that your brakes are actually functional and stopping your wheels. And then with the C, I'm going to make sure my chain is on by picking up my back wheel and spinning. And if my chain is misset, it'll fix itself by pedaling forwards. I'm going to pay attention to how my wheel rolls. No rubbing, everything feels good. Then I'll check my front wheel by giving that a good spin. And if that feels good, and then because I have quick release levers, I'm going to double check my quick releases. I'm going to check this quick releases down. It feels good. I'm going to check my back wheel quick release, which you can't see, but it's there. That's functional too. And then my seat post as well. And again, you want to know this because every so often you might not realize it, but levers can open up. And if your seat is wobbly, you can't control your bike with your body and you might end up crashing. So I'll do the ABC check real quick so you get to see what it is. Sorry for my disembodied head. You're going to have a squeeze of the tires for the A, squeeze of the brakes for the B, a roll of the rear wheel via the chain, that feels good, and then a rolling of the front wheel, and that feels good as well, and then check the quick releases if you've got. That's the ABC quick check. I'll take a quick pause to check the chat, and then we'll dive right in. Ooh, what if the chain comes off the gears? Okay. We'll cover that when we get to it, but if the chain ever falls off, you can put it back on, and I'll show you how to do that when we get to the C. But chances are, all you got to do is literally pick up the chain, make a little slack first, pick up the chain, put it on the gears, and pedal forwards. All right, let's jump right in. So, say you've done your ABC check. Great, your bike is safe to roll, excellent. But there's certain things you're going to want to keep an eye on pretty regularly. We'll start with A for air. Now, if this were a part of my 6th grader class, I'd say, where is the air in this bike? And I'd say about half of you would know. Inside of the tire is a tube, an inner tube that you can't see, which takes air and inflates and creates some structure, makes this strong, and is what you're basically riding on. You're riding on air. Cool thing about a bike is that air is actually pretty good at making riding cushy. By that, it's like a little bit of suspension. If this were solid rubber, you would feel every crack in the pavement. It would also be a lot heavier because it's a lot of rubber, and you wouldn't go as fast because there'd be a lot of friction. So the fact that there's air in here also allows me to change how much pressure and how hard or soft my tire is. But the concern is that air can leak out of the tire. Naturally, it's normal. And so you're going to want to keep an eye on how much air is in your tires. This is why we're going to need, like I mentioned, a pump so that we can not just inflate the tires, but we're going to check to see what it's rated at. Now, your bike is going to be different than my bike. So I'm going to want you to follow along with your bike, and I'll try to make this as basic and universal as possible. But the first thing you're going to want to know is how much air should be in the tires. And do any of you know how I can tell how much air should be in the tires? And here's a hint. There's a unit of pressure. It stands for PSI, which means pounds per square inch. So where on my bike will it tell me how much PSI should be in my tire? The answer is it's actually written on the side of the tire. Every tire has a little number embossed on it, basically kind of printed on the tire itself, that'll tell you how much pressure it is rated to. And it's usually a PSI, which again stands for pounds per square inch. So let's see on my bike where the PSI is actually written. Now, this is sometimes hard to see. So let's see if we can find it. It's right here. And it's a little hard to see with my lighting in my basement, but you'll see it says 35 to 80 PSI. See how small that is? And if the tire is really worn out, you might not even be able to see it, in which case I probably want to replace my tire or have a bike mechanic replace my tire. But look on your bike. What is the PSI range on your bike? Feel free to chime in on the chat if you've got your bike there or you know it offhand, because it doesn't change. Once I know what the PSI is, it's good. But what is the range or the maximum maybe, it might only have one number, that your tire should be pumped up to? If you tell me what your PSI is, I bet you I can tell you what type of bike you have. On my bike, it's a mountain bike, which again is a wider tire, which means I can go pretty low in my PSI to 35. But it's also rated to be ridden on the street, which can go all the way up to 80 PSI. So this tire has a wide range. Not every tire does. Some tires need to be pumped up relatively to just 1 PSI, and that's it. But because this is a pretty versatile tire that can do a lot of stuff, it can go off-road and go on-road, I've got a range of what my PSI actually is. So feel free to chime in the chat if you get the chance to let me know what your PSI is. If you don't know it, now's a great time to go check. And on my bike, I actually have 2 different tires. So it's not good enough just to know what my front tire is. I'm also going to want to know what my rear tire is as well. But that said, I'm just going to worry about my front tire because that makes it easy. So now that I know what hey Dimitri, good to see you. Your PSI is 100. Yes, you do have a road bike. So you'll see that my PSI is 35, which is much lower. One of you is a 30 to 65. It's probably similar to mine with a mountain bike, which means it's probably a wider tire. Maybe it's a cruiser. It doesn't have to be knobby, but it's probably wider. And again, the story is the wider the tire, the lower the pressure. The skinnier the tire, the higher the pressure. But look on your bike to see what PSI it should be at. All right. Now that you know what it should be at, let's check it. The best way to check how much PSI is in your bike is actually to hook up a pump that has a gauge. This is my gauge right here. That'll tell me how much air is in my tire. But before I do that, I need to explain a little bit about how the air system works. So you'll see here that my wheel is pretty, there's not much changing in my wheel, but if you'll see that there's one part of it right here called the valve. And the valve goes through my rim, and this is actually how I access my inner tube. Let me show you an inner tube here. this is what's inside of the tire, and you'll see that my valve sticks out from my inner tube. Now there's two different types of valves. There's a Presta valve, which is the thinner one. This is the one right here. And there's a Schrader valve, which is a fatter one, which is this one right here. If you have a lower pressure system, between 30 and 65, chances are you've got a Schrader valve. It's a little bit wider. This is the common valve that's used in car tires as well. So actually, this bike pump can actually pump up a car tire too. Take a little longer, but it's the same concept, the same valve. And the other type of system is a Presta valve made for higher pressure. So I'm going to guess with Dimitri's bike that he's got a Presta valve and not a Schrader valve, because the Schrader cannot do such high pressure. And I'll tell you why. So first off, see the nuances and the differences to the the valves, mainly in their size. The Schrader is much bigger, which means in order to fit through the wheel, I have to drill a bigger hole in my rim. So if I'm using a skinnier wheel, I can have a skinnier valve, and thus the Presta. That's why there's two. There's really only two. You can have a Schrader and you can have a Presta. Now the way that the Schrader works is you can see there's like a little piece of metal inside, which when I put my pump head on, and I'll demonstrate here, if I put my pump head on the Schrader valve and I open it up, what happens is it pushes that little piece of metal in, and then I can actually get air into the tube, and then I can take my pump head off, and it stays in there, and I'm not worried about it because there's a spring inside of here with some rubber, and that makes the seal. So this is the Schrader. You don't really need to know anything more than just put the pump head on and pump. It's not quite the same with a Presta. So you'll see here with a Presta valve that the very top, there's a little piece of metal that I have to unscrew. See how I unscrewed that? And now I can actually access the valve. I can pull this little piece of metal up and down. And what this is the seal. So I can seal my bike tire like this, or I could open it like this. If you're going to put air in a Presta valve, you need to know that this little tip is super, super important, because in order to get the pump head to interface with the Presta valve to actually put air in there, you have to unscrew this tip. Now, once it's unscrewed, I'm going to put my pump head on, open it up, and then as I pump, you'll see the tube starts to take shape. It becomes more three-dimensional by putting a little bit of air in there. And again, this tube is what's inside of this tire. Now I'm going to take my pump head off, and you'll see that because my valve is still all the way unscrewed, I can actually let air out. See if you can hear it. So I'm not done just by putting air into this. I actually have to take this tip and screw it back down. And now my valve is sealed. I'm going to keep the air in. Some folks don't know that. And some folks only know the Schrader valves because they're not familiar with the road bikes. And that's totally fine. But this is one of the most basic and crucial things to know, that if you have this style, you're going to want to make sure that you know how this tip works. So unscrewing it, opens it, and then I can let air out. Or if I have a pump, while it's open, I can put the pump on and put air in. But then once I'm done, I need to make sure that I closed it and that it's sealed. All right. So feel free to let me know what type of valve you have, along with what pressure. It's good to see some folks are chiming in with the pressure, but do you have a Schrader valve or do you have a Presta valve? Now, it's very important to know because that's going to be something that stays constant on your bike. All right. So once you know what valve you have, you're going to want to know how the pump works. Let me just put this here so you can see my valve. My pump has two different holes. You can see that. I have a bigger hole in the top and a smaller hole in the bottom. One is for Schrader, the top one. One is for Presta, it's the bottom one. So I have one pump head with two different spots. your pump might be different. You might only have one pump with only one hole that uses both types of valves, which is great. That makes things a lot easier. Or maybe you've got a pump with a dual head where one side is for Schrader and the other side is for Presta. It really changes, it really varies. Every pump is a little bit different. Great, we have both Presta and Schrader, excellent. So you should know that there is a pump interface that you're going to have to be a little bit concerned with, or at least know how it works. Again, with this one, it just changes which hole I use. And you can kind of see in my light that in my Schrader one, I wonder if I could get the light in there. In the top one, there's a little piece of plastic inside of there, which is actually used to push in the valve once I've opened it. And then I can fill it full of air. All right, so I know what pressure I need to get to. I know what valve I have, and now I know how my pump works. So I'm gonna put my pump head on the valve, and it's okay if a little air comes out. Let me angle down a little bit, and you'll see that I activate my pump by flicking open. You can kind of see I flicked open my pump head, and that's how I've sealed the system between my pump and my inner tube. Again, your pump is going to be a little more finicky. Your pump might be a little more tricky. Every pump is troublesome. So hopefully this makes it easy for you to know that you're not alone and that it's actually kind of tough sometimes to get familiar with your pump. But once you've put it on, and the way mine opens is it, again, locks into place, I'm going to want to put a couple of pumps of air in there. And what that'll do is it'll normalize the hose right here with my inner tube so I'll know what pressure it's at. So once I've got my pump on there, I'm going to go all the way up and all the way down, and maybe I'll just do one more. So what that does is it'll tell me a good reading on my pump gauge. And it's a little tricky to see, but for those of you with good eyes, you might be able to see that this has me at about 40 PSI. You see how it says 40? Now, this pump, depending on the bike tire, can go all the way up to 160. Whoa, that's way too much. I don't know a pump that can, or a tire that can actually hold 160. Most top out at about 100 PSI, which is already a lot. But mine right now is at 40. So what I'm going to want to do is actually squeeze my tire to know what 40 feels like. And this is what I want you to learn how to do, is actually take different readings at different pressure levels. And the tool that I want you to go home with is really just what does it feel like at that pressure. Right now, 40, you can see that's a little bit of squish. It's kind of hard to see, but I can do a little bit of squish, but not a lot. Doesn't feel rock hard, but this is, again, just 5 PSI more than my minimum, my absolute minimum. So even a little bit of squish, I got to be a little worried that I might not have enough air in there. I can go all the way to 80. So what I might do is actually pump up a little bit more to the mid-range. I'll pump up to about 50 and give that a squeeze and know what 50 feels like. And then, you know, if we had a little bit more time, I'd go all the way to 80 and it would be rock hard. So I'm going to want to know, the skill I want you to go home with is what does it feel like at different ranges? Because when we do the A test, when all we're doing is squeezing our tires every time before we ride, we're going to need to know, based off memory, muscle memory, if my tire is squishy or if my tire is hard. So once I've pumped up to somewhere within my range, and again, you'll see that, you know, I'm at about 45, so I'm just under 50, so I don't even have that much air in here, but already it feels much harder, but I'm comfortable with that. So what I'm going to do is gently close my pump and then pull it as directly off as possible. It's a little tricky if you haven't done this before. You have to be very careful about making sure that the pump goes straight on and comes straight off if you're ever putting it on your valve, because if I'll show you here, the way that the valve works is it's sealed on with just a little bit of rubber. So it's actually pretty easy to tear right down here. So if you ever find yourself yanking the pump head off of your valve, you might end up tearing your inner tube and then you've broken your tube and then you need to replace it and you can't ride your bike. So get familiar with putting the pump head on as directly straight as possible to lock it. And then once it's unlocked, pull it off directly straight as possible and be careful. All right, that said, the skill to go home with is what does it feel like at different pressure ranges. Now I have a range, let me go back to my range, of between 35 and 80. Now, why is there a range? The range exists because different tires are manufactured differently, they're made differently. Some really can do a wide stretch, like this mountain biking. So if I was going to go off-road, I'd want to be a softer tire. And what that allows me to do, it gives me more squish in my tire, which means my tire can dig just a little bit more in the dirt, in the grass, and the gravel. If I had this pumped all the way to 80 PSI, that's pretty hard. That's what road bikes are generally at. And I tried to go off-road, I wouldn't be able to get the traction because my tire wouldn't dig. It would just be on the top of the surface and I would just be pedaling and spinning. So if I was going to go off-road, I'd want to keep this lower. But when you're riding at a lower pressure, what happens is the squish that takes place in the tire causes, I guess we'll call it friction, or it makes for a squishier ride, which is not as efficient. So a harder tire means less contact of the rubber on the road, which means that you get more power out of every pedal stroke. And if you're only going to be on pavement, you actually don't need a lot of contact between the rubber and the pavement because this is made really well. This rubber is awesome. So if you're on pavement, you actually can be at a higher pressure, which means your tires do not squish whatsoever. Yeah, exactly. So especially for tri-bikes, triathlon bikes, speed is of the essence, not traction. So if you're going to race a triathlon, you want to go fast. So therefore, you're going to be at a higher pressure generally. It's a road bike. On a mountain bike, you can dig in a little bit, and it just allows that little bit more grip. As long as you're within the range, though, I don't really care what you ride at. It's a personal comfort level. If you want to ride harder and faster, you want to be at the upper end of the range, or if you want to be a little squishier and maybe a little more comfortable, you could be at the lower end of the range. Yes, there is, the pressure may also depend on weight. That's a really good call too. If you're a pretty heavy person, you might want to go a little bit higher, and I'll talk about why. But I'll also say that bikes are generally made for up to 300 or 350 pounds as a rating. So, and don't get me wrong, there are people who are larger folks who are riding their bikes, and that's great, and they can have special bikes. I actually know a guy who has a bike made out of titanium, and he was able to ride a bike, and he actually went from 450 pounds to 350 pounds riding his bike, but he had to have some special modifications to a bike. But for most average bikes, as long as you're less than 300 pounds, it's probably not going to make that big a difference. However, the trouble with being a softer tire, I talked about the squish. What can also happen is the inner tube can squish and actually get caught between the tire and the rim, the metal rim, and get what's called a pinch flat. So what'll happen is the tube will get caught and get two little puncture holes, which happen because the tire compresses and the rim is a little sharp. So if the tube can squish too much, you run the risk of getting a pinch flat or a snake bite flat. When I worked at a bike shop, I worked at Landry's bike shops for 5 years. I'd say about 90% of the flats that we got in the shop were pinch flats. And that is caused by too little pressure. The tire is too soft, so there's too much squish in the tire, and you hit a pothole, or go off a curb, or you hit a rock, and that little bit of squish causes the tire to compress, causes the tube to pinch, and then you get a pinch flat. Most tires, though, as long as you're at least at the minimum, so as long as I'm at least at 35, I'm pretty safe from pinch flats. But if I go any lower, then you run the risk of getting a pinch flat just because there's too much squish. So hope that answered that question. Depending on the weight of the person, depending on the style of riding, depending on the terrain and where they're riding, you can be within that range at whatever your comfort level is. Personally, I like to ride a little squishier, a little slower, but I want to actually get places quickly. So if I were riding this bike on the roads, I'd probably go to about 50 or 60 PSI, knowing that I can take air out of the tire if I was ever really going to go off-roading. So it's a long-winded way to show you how to pump up your tires, but again, the take-home is know the rating of the tires, know what type of valve you have, and this one's a Schrader, and then know how the pump interfaces with it so that you can check it, and know the squeeze test for what different PSIs are. And once you get the squeeze test down, you're good to go so that you can just do a quick A squeeze. You don't really need to worry about the pump. But you will want to put air in your tires maybe once a week. If you ride every day, you're going to lose about 10 to 20 PSI just normally. Air comes out, it's just an imperfect system. Valves are like anything else, not perfect, and they do degrade over time, and you will get a slow leak, a very, very slow leak. But even if you let your bike sit without even riding it for a month, you might end up with flat tires. So if it's been a little while since you've checked your tires, go ahead and make sure that you have a pump and that you are actually checking your PSI. Also, if you find yourself a little sluggish out there and you're a little slower than you think you ought to be, chances are you just need to put a little bit more air in your tires and you'll make a more faster, efficient, arguably a little harder, but a more efficient, faster ride. All right, so again, with the A, the take-home knowledge is just how does it feel at different pressures? And ooh, my rear one's kind of soft. So if I was actually going to take this out, I definitely want to pump that up a little bit more. All right, I'll take a quick pause. If there's anything about the A's that I haven't covered, I'm going to move right on to the B. Great, thank you so much. All right, so we talked about A stands for air, B stands for brakes. Brakes are arguably the most important part about biking because you're going to have to stop when you're out there. And you're going to want to, excellent, thank you. You're going to need to stop sometimes in an emergency. Maybe a driver pulls out of a driveway, or you're riding in a group and somebody goes down, or a rabbit jumps out in front of you. You're going to want to make sure that you've got good stopping power to stop your bike. Now, a couple of things to know about how the brakes work. I have two different types of brakes here. I have a front brake. You can see it activating with my left hand. And then I've got a back brake with my right hand. See if I can get in the shot. You'll see it activating down there. It's all a cable that flows through my frame and is activated with the levers. So these are cable pull activated rim brakes. Your bike might be a little bit different, but we're going to cover mine. So you have a front brake and a back brake. Here's my question for you. Which one stops you quicker? Which one is the stronger brake? Is it the front brake right here, or is it the back brake with my right hand? The answer is, if you stop something at the front of the brake, of its momentum, you'll actually stop it and it won't go anywhere. This is the stronger brake. The stronger stopping power is at the front of the bike. Now that means if you stop real quick, your weight of your body will still keep moving forwards. And if it moves forward so far, especially over the front axle, your bike might go up and you might fly over your handlebars. Has that ever happened to anybody where you've stopped in an emergency and you hit your front brake a little too hard? It's happened to me. Usually when that happens to people, they are scared of their front brake and they never use it anymore and they just do their back brake. But if you only use your back brake, even though my wheel stops in my rear, you'll see the wheel won't turn, my bike can still slide forward. And that means I'm out of control. Even if my wheel stops turning, if I'm only stopping in the back, my bike will still slide, and that's based on momentum. It's another physics term. But the idea of getting familiar with the front brake and the back brake together will mean that you can stop controlled and safely so that you don't flip over forwards and that you don't just keep skidding into whatever you're trying to avoid. So know that there are differences in how strong the front and the back brake are. That just means get used to it. That also means that you can change how much pressure it takes to actually activate the brake based on the cable tension. And by that, I mean the cable itself, which runs from the brake up to the lever, can be looser or tighter. And what I'm going to teach you in a minute is how to tighten or loosen the cable yourself with no tools needed. Before I do that though, I'm going to want to demonstrate a little bit about the brake. The brake itself, as you can see in the front, is a piece of rubber that attaches to a shoe, which closes on the rim. So the first thing I want you to do on your bike is take a look at your brakes, if they're similar to mine, and when you close the brakes, do the brake pads hit the rim? Sometimes they can be moved, and sometimes only half the brake is hitting, or sometimes it's hitting the tire, which is really bad. You want to make sure that the rubber of this pad, which is not very big, as you can see, is fully on the rim so that you get as much stopping power as possible. Next thing I want you to check, and my bike is different than yours, but I'm going to open up my brakes. If you know how to open up your brakes, great. Sometimes there's like a little dial that you can turn right at the brake, and it'll kind of make your brakes a little wider. If you ever unhook your brakes, you're going to want to rehook them. But I'm unhooking it so you can see my brake pad. And you'll see that I have a pretty good amount of rubber on my brake pad right here. So I'm not too worried about it. But over time, the pad will wear down and I'm going to need to replace it. Totally normal. I go through about 2 or 3 sets of brake pads a year. But you'll also see little bits of metal or debris that you'll need to clean out of the brake pad, which I recommend using rubbing alcohol or maybe a little piece of, a small tool to clean out the brake pad. But know how much brake pad you have left, and then know that it's in good condition. I've got plenty of brake pad left, but if I were wearing down, you'll see that I get down to metal when I'm worn out of pad, and then I'm actually scraping the metal of the brake into my rim. That's no good. I'm gonna need to replace my brake pad, which means I'm taking my bike to a bike shop in order to change their brake pads. But on my bike, you'll see I've got plenty of pad. You'll see that my pad actually hits the rim, and when I can reattach my brake, and again, don't feel free to just unattach your brakes unless you know how to do it. I'm going to test it, and it feels pretty good. So I've got good pad, good contact. Now I'm going to see how much power I have when I actually hit my brakes. So if you've got good pads, and if they're attached well, next thing I want you to look at is where along the cable system, by that I mean from the brake lever down to the brake, there's probably a little barrel. And this is the pro tip that a lot of folks don't know, is that this barrel right here that I can turn, because it's ridged and I don't need any tools for it, I can actually turn this barrel up and turn it down. I can unscrew this barrel and I can actually end up tightening my cable. You'll see on this bike, I actually have a little black inner lock, and that's the lock ring, that once I'm unscrewed my barrel, I can lock it into place. But now I've made my brakes tighter, and you'll see that when I lock out, I want to fit about 2 fingers between my brake lever and my handlebar. And this feels nice and strong. But in order to make it strong, I had to unscrew this, what's called a barrel adjuster. If I move my lock ring out of the way and I screw my barrel adjuster in, I've just loosened my brakes. Loosened it to the point where I can actually pull my brake all the way to the handlebar and still roll my bike, which means my brakes are not activated, which means my cable is way too loose and I am riding dangerously. This is why we do the B check to make sure it works. So you find the brake barrel adjuster, and you can adjust it by unscrewing it. You'll see it kind of come out a little bit. And then I've got a separate lock to lock it into place. And now my brake locks out right there, and I can fit at least 2 fingers between my brake arm and my handlebar. Find the barrel adjuster on your brakes. You've got 2 sets of brakes because you have a front wheel and a back wheel. Play around with it. No tools needed. You can adjust your brakes while you're riding, maybe even while you're pedaling, to make them a little stronger or make them a little looser. And it's a personal preference. A lot of people say, do you want them tighter or looser? As long as you can do an emergency stop, you're fine. So don't worry about it. It's just a personal preference. Some people like a little bit stronger in the back because it's just, they feel more comfortable putting a little more power back there and they're worried about flipping forwards. It's not very common, but it's, a concern. So just get to know it's a personal preference as to which strength you have for your brakes. But the be all end all is the B check, which is close the brakes, and rock the bike to make sure that your brakes are functional. Okay, so again, with the brakes, I know I'm covering a lot of ground. How is the pad looking? Is the pad hitting the rim properly? And how is the cable? Does it need to be tighter? Does it need to be looser? Depend on your preference. And then front brake versus back brake is super important. There are other types of brakes we're not talking about. There's disc brakes, there's hydraulic brakes. There's the type of brakes where you actually pedal backwards to stop. We're not going to cover those right now because we don't have enough time. But if you have any specific questions about that, throw that in the chat and I'll try to answer them before we round out. Okay, so that's the B. Again, the be all end all for the B is do your brakes lock out with enough space and do your wheel stop. Cool. So my B is pretty darn good. Okay. Moving on to the C. So the C is the chain, what I like to call the go of the bike. Now, it's pretty complex down here. Try to get in the frame too. It's pretty complex down here because there's lots of moving pieces down. If I pedal backwards, you can see the chain moving. You can see the rear cassette, the gears moving. And if I were to lift up my bike and pedal forwards, and there's a lot of shifting that's going on. So what I want you to notice about the chain is it's real tiny and it's real fragile, but yet it takes the full weight of your pedal and your foot and pushes down on it in order to have the rear wheel move. If you ever get in a spot where, I can put it here, where it's kind of like skipping, you can almost hear it. That probably means you're in the wrong gear. So just shift a little bit and then pedal forwards. And chances are, whatever gear you're set to, it'll move to as long as you're pedaling forwards. I'll demonstrate a minute here in the front. Keep an eye on my front gear. I'm going to move to the hardest gear. Notice that the chain really only skips gears once I'm pedaling forwards. And pay attention right here. You see how this chain is floating? It's between gears right now. It's actually not attached onto the teeth, which could be a tricky situation if I was pedaling hard. So I'm going to want to pedal forwards, and you'll see the chain start to lock into place. And once a full pedal stroke rotation, now my chain is on where it needs to be. But it took about a full pedal stroke around in order for my chain to lock into place. So that's a quick way to show you that while you're changing gears, you need to be pedaling forwards. But while you're pedaling, you need to be chill about it and not put a lot of force into it, because there's only a few teeth of the cogs that actually catch in order to get all the rest of the chain on there. So until you're actually locked into a gear and you're not changing gears, you still pedal forwards, but you need to pedal lightly, which I know is tricky, especially if you're on a hill, but it's about practice. Okay, so that's a little bit about the gearing. We had a question about the derailleurs. It's a little bit more than I think we're up for here, but I want to touch on it briefly, is that especially on the rear derailleur. So I usually don't go into this, but you'll see the cable come down. So this is my rear derailleur. And this cable goes up to my shifter, and you can see that when I pull the cable, it moves my derailleur. I talked a little bit about the barrel adjuster on my brakes. By unscrewing my barrel adjuster, I tighten my cable. The same could be done down here on your derailleur. This is totally a 2.0 tangent, so if you're not following along, this is not part of the ABCs, but I want to make sure I cover it. That if you're skipping in between gears, you might be able to take this barrel, which is probably right where the cable comes into the derailleur, and turn it clockwise or counterclockwise just a little bit. And I only mean like a quarter of a turn or a half a turn at most. And it will change the indexing. And by that, I mean how each click sets into place for the chain. When I make the cable tighter, it pulls the derailleur in. If I were to make the cable looser, it would let the derailleur out. But you only really want to mess with this barrel adjuster, maybe one click or two clicks tops. And it's the same principle as the barrel for the brakes. Unscrewing it ends up tightening the cable, which means that the chain and the derailleur is set a little bit further inboard, or loosening the cable allows the chain to sit out a little bit, which goes outboard, which I know is not part of the ABCs, but I hope that was a taste of how your derailleur system indexes. If there's any more questions about the indexing, I can probably cover it, but I want to make sure I round out in the next 5 minutes of cleaning the chain. Okay, so the chain, it's fragile. It needs to take a lot of weight and a lot of force, but it also gets really grimy and really dirty. So the C of the ABCs is to make sure that your chain is working, is clean, and is not full of gunk. So in order to do that, what I'm going to end up doing is actually, I'm going to flip my bike upside down, which I don't really recommend very much. And the reason I don't recommend it is because now my handlebars and my shifting and my brakes are on the ground, and it's not really good. But sometimes you have to do it, especially for demonstration purposes. But even better for demonstration purposes is my wooden chain link. So the cool thing about this wooden chain link is it's actually fully functional. And you'll see it rotates, and it's got some rollers, and it's got a pin, and I can even slide the pin out to show you how the chain goes together. So I can take a pin, I can remove the outer link, I could have my inner link, and you see these rollers? You see these right here? This gets a lot of movement when you're pedaling. So what goes on is as you're riding, the rollers help the chain move, but you can see that they kind of can hollow out, especially if your chain's really dirty and really grimy. And if you haven't been taking care of your chain, imagine all the grit that gets caught inside of a chain. And if I'm putting my chain back together, you'll see that my chain really does move quite a bit, but if I get gunk inside of here, I can't really get it out, and it just wears away my chain, which means my chain becomes really wiggly, which means I have to replace it. It's normal. You'll have to replace your chain. It's not a big deal. But the best way to keep your chain nice and happy is to clean out the inside of the gunk and replace it with lubrication, with oil. If this is nice and oiled in here, there's not any room for the gunk to gather, which means that your chain stays nice and happy and flowing. So what we're going to cover today is cleaning the chain. It's a pretty easy process. All you're going to need is some chain lube and a rag. Now I've got two different types of chain lube. I've got a really thin kind and a really thick kind. The thick kind over here is really made for wet conditions. The thin kind is made for dry conditions. I like to use the dry kind a little bit more, really as a preference thing. But you know, there's a ton of different types of bike lubes, just as long as it's bike specific, that's fine. You can do what you want, but make sure it's chain lube for a bike. So the way that you clean a chain, it's a pretty easy 4-step process. The first step is wipe it down. Clean it off, get any gunk off, any mud off, any gunk off. It's like brushing your teeth before going to the dentist. Wipe it down. Second is you apply lubrication at every link where the links meet to make sure that the lube gets in between the gears, in between the links, and holds it firm. The third step is running the chain, maybe 5 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe go on a bike ride, but let the chain lube work its way through the chain. And the fourth step, it's the same as the first, you just wipe it down and clean off any gunk. So I'll demonstrate real quick. All you need is a rag. You gotta wipe the chain down. I might wipe these pulley wheels down, and I could pedal backwards. Even though my chain's pretty clean, you'll see I'm getting some gunk off. You can do this all day long, and you'll still be getting gunk off the chain. If the chain falls off, because somebody asked that, if the chain ever comes off like this, I know, it's pretty scary. It looks pretty intimidating, but the way you solve that is giving yourself a little slack with the derailleur, picking up the chain, putting the chain back on the gears, just putting it back on, and then pedaling forwards. Again, always pedal forwards, and I've just fixed my chain. So if the chain ever falls off, chances are you can literally just pull it back on, and then off the bike, just pedal, and it will fix itself. So back to the point of step 1 of cleaning the chain. All you gotta do is wipe and wipe and wipe. And you can do this forever, but I don't know, just give it a good wipe. Second step, take your chain lube, and you want to put one drop where the links meet. Literally just one tiny little drop. There's two types of people in the world. Well, there's a million types of people. There's 7 billion types of people. But there's type A and there's type B. Type A people go one drop, one drop, one drop, one drop. It's fine. Type B people have a small steady stream and just pedal, and they assume that the chain grease is going to hit every link. I don't care what you do. Let me know in the chat if you're a type A person and want to hit every link individually, or if you're a type B person and just want to run the chain and make it nice and quick. Whatever works, just get a little bit of chain lube in every link. That's step 2. Step 3, wait. You gotta work it. You gotta work it into the chain. Some people go on a bike ride, but again, the idea of making the chain lube flush into the chain, but then clear out of the chain takes time. And the longer you wait, the better chance it has of making its way through the chain. Some people just like to wait overnight. Some people like to go on a ride. Whatever it takes a little bit of time. You can't do it immediately. Because again, the goal is to get a meat inside of the chain. So you want to put the drop right in the middle where the chain links meet. Once you feel comfortable that you've waited long enough or worked the chain long enough, the last step really is just wiping down your chain. It's that easy, just the same as the number 1 step. And the goal is you don't really need any chain grease on the outside of the chain. That's all extra. What you want to get is where the chain links meet. That's the flowy part, that's the functional part, that's where all the rolling is. And when that gets gunky, that's the problem. Anything on the outside that you can wipe off is extra. So all you got to do is just wipe it off. Some people hold the sides of the chain and then do the top of the chain, or they'll do a bottom of the chain. You might want to have gloves on. I don't have gloves on, but that's okay. But again, I'm just kind of rolling my chain and wiping it, and you'll see that all that gunk starts to come off. I'm going to want to do this at least every month and a half or so, every 4 to 6 weeks if I haven't done it in a while. Or if it's been really rainy and I've been riding in the rain, because that means a lot of gunk in there. Or if it sounds like I'm riding with a family of mice and every time you pedal it goes squeak, 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 you're going to need some chain lube. And it's not a degreaser. It's not a WD-40. It's not anything except just a little bit of chain lubrication made for bikes. You can clean your chain with a degreaser if you want, which is fine. But if you do that, then you need to reapply lubrication to make sure that the grease actually is in the chain. Because if you clean out the inside of the chain and clean out the gunk, and you don't put lubricant in there, this actually fills with air, and that brings moisture, and that attracts rust. So you can actually make your chain rustier by cleaning it if you're not using not using a lubrication. So you need a grease to really do its work. All right, so again, with the chain, what you're gonna have to know with the chain is it clean, is it functional, or is it really rusty? So that's the C, putting the chain back on and cleaning it. That's the C of the ABCs, air, brakes, and chain. Just to round us out before I go for a few more questions, and I appreciate everybody sticking around. One more time for the ABCs. We've got squeezing of the tires, knowing how that feels. You've got squeezing of the brakes, making sure that you've got enough space and that the wheels actually lock out. Great. And that the chain is on the bike, because if it's ever fallen off, you've got to actually put it back on, which is fine, and then pedal forwards. And then how does it feel? Does it feel like it's rolling okay? Feels great. And then give a quick roll in the front, and you're ready to roll 2. And then if you've got the cue, like I mentioned earlier, do a quick cue check just the same. And that right there is the entirety of the basics of the ABC Quick Check. I thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions, so feel free to pop it in the chat. And you guys are doing great. Cool. Any questions? Now, I would recommend doing the ABC check really every single time before you ride. Even if you're riding to the store or to get lunch, you might not realize that you've got a slow leak. So you might come out from lunch and then your tire's flat and then you're like, I should have checked it. Or maybe somebody parked next to you and they jostled your bike and your quick release lever got open. Or I showed you how easy it was to open up my brake. Your bike might not be that easy, but I'm going to want to know if my brakes are unhooked before I'm halfway down the hill. And I will tell you from experience, I've broken a chain because I didn't oil it, didn't grease it, and I didn't realize it was in bad condition. I've ridden on flat tires and then had to walk back home realizing that I might have damaged my wheels because I just didn't check it. Or it was too soft when I squeezed it and I didn't fill it. And so I rode slowly and then got a pinch flat and then had to walk home. Or my brakes were unhooked and gosh, I tried to stop and I panicked. So make sure that you're doing your ABC check, and this is what you are responsible for doing at home every single time. Anything more than that, that's what your local bike shop is for. And you've got plenty of mechanics there who will be more than happy to show you how your bike works. Might be different than my bike. And yeah, again, just the basics. Okay. I wish I could get a little feedback. I see a Q in the Q&A. Let's see here. How often should a chain be cleaned? Chain should be cleaned really depending on how you ride. If you only ride in fair weather and no rain, only on pavement, it's kind of okay. Different than, say, riding in the dirt, in the mud, after a rainy day. So a couple of things. If your shifting is grimy, and it means you shift and it takes a minute or two for the chain to actually lock into place, that might be a dirty chain, and that might need to be a lubricated chain. And once you clean it and lubricate it, I bet you it's going to snap into place whenever you're shifting. If your chain is really old and you shift and it takes a little bit of time and you can feel it's really wiggly, you might just need to get a new chain, which, again, I replace a chain about once a year in the spring. Or if you ever ride in the winter time, the winter is full of salt and full of sand that you ride through. And that just gets inside. You can imagine, where'd my chain link go? You can imagine that all the salt that you ride through and the sand gets inside of these rollers. And so you're going to want to clean your chain much more frequently in the winter time and the foul weather. So a lot of it does depend, Michael, on how your terrain and your weather is. And typically, do you pedal really hard? Do you pedal in the hardest gear the whole time? Do you put a lot of strain on your chain? So there's not one real answer, but if I had to give you one answer, I'd say if it's been a month or 6 weeks, clean your chain. Yep. So frequency wise, pumping the tires is the most common. Cleaning the chain is probably the next most common. And the third most common is probably playing around with the barrel adjusters on your brakes. And then, changing your brake pads maybe once a season if you ride a lot. Excellent. Cool. I'll hang around for a few more minutes. If you have any other questions, I appreciate the feedback. And I know it's strange as a webinar. I really wish we were in person right now, but I'm grateful to have you out there, and I'm glad that you're interested in riding. And anything else that I can do to encourage you to ride and ride safely, I am here to be a resource for you. Please check out massbike.org. We are a membership-driven organization. We appreciate your donations and your membership. We'll keep you apprised on some of the advocacy campaigns. We're working on, it might be a long shot, but we're working on a Cape Ann bike master plan, which might start out of Gloucester, but we're probably several years away from that. But if you see what's going on in Beverly and you see what's going on in Salem, we're hoping to get that ripple effect to make its way through the rest of the Cape. My favorite places to ride are up there, just the rolling hills and the farmlands. It's absolutely lovely. And once we can get to the opening up phases, I probably find myself on the Ipswich River camping at least once or twice this summer. So thank you so much. Any thoughts to why numbness occurs in the toes and fingers when riding? Excellent question. Well, I will put it as a couple things, is that there's 3 points of contact when you're on a bike. You have your hands, you have your feet, and you have your bum. There are certain things that you can have to minimize some of the vibrations that are going on. The first is to wear gloves. So gloves that are bike specific will have gel pads in the palms, and they do wonders for being shock absorbers. So if you're not wearing gloves yet, gloves is going to be the first step. The second step is if you are getting numbness with the gloves, it might be the position of your arms and your hands. So this bike is particular because it's a mountain bike. It's designed for multiple different positioning for hands. On a road bike, you probably have something similar, but I will say that everybody's body is different. So there's something called a bike fit, which if you're unfamiliar with a bike fit, a good bike shop will be able to measure you, measure your flexibility, and measure your body. And you can actually modify your bike by changing out the handlebars, changing the seat, changing the shoes that you wear to actually fit your body. One of the biggest challenges I face out there are people thinking that their bike is uncomfortable. It's the bike's fault and not the body's fault. You got to get a bike that fits your body. So having a professional bike fit is basically like going to a doctor and getting an assessment and to see what your flexibility is. And then you just modify the bike, changing out the components, the handlebars, the pads, the seat, so that it fits your body. For the shoes, and I will say, for those of you who want to jump, that's totally fine. We're past the ABCs, and I'll stick around to answer questions. So if you do want to go, that's totally fine, and I appreciate that you're here. For toes, a lot of the numbness might come, are you clipped in? So if you could answer whether or not you're riding with your shoes locked into the pedals. And if that's the case, it might be getting some insoles for the shoes to increase blood flow, or changing the angle in which your shoe actually locks into the pedal. And that's actually done with a bike fit as well. That's like a lower level bike fit, is to make sure that your ankle and your hip and your knee, the way the ratio and the way they line up is different for everybody. So the cleats on the bottom of your shoes are adjustable to fit the way that your flexibility is. Don't think that your body is going to lock into place. So you're not locked in, but using spike pedals and mountain bike shoes. Well, and that's the case. It might be that the pedals themselves might be hard. It sounds like you're using metal pedals, which is good for mountain biking. You don't want pedals to break. So it might be a combination of maybe thinking about shoe insoles or getting some padded socks as well. Specific cycling socks add a little bit of cushion, but any sort of cushion, because again, you have your hands, your feet, and your bum, and all the vibrations from your bike get rocked on those 3 points. And especially if you're going to be on a bike for several hours, that's generally the case. But yeah, it might be that the pedals you're using are just pretty stiff. And by that, I mean, they're just like very hard metal, which is good for mountain biking so they don't break. But also means that all of those vibrations are translated up into your knees and your ankles and your feet. And a little bit of it is everybody's a little bit different circulatorily. So it might be that you can ride for a little bit, but then like think of ways of wiggling your hands and wiggling your feet to kind of increase blood flow. The trouble with biking is you're kind of locked into one position and there's just hundreds of thousands of rotations in one mode. So yeah, estimated cost to get a good fit. I'd say between $100 and $300 is typically a good fit. If you go the $300 route, if you're a triathlete, it's worth it because they will increase your efficiency amazingly with a bike fit. There's differences. It's going to be hard to mimic here on Zoom, but there's differences between this versus this versus this, and the way the hip and the ankle and the knee relate can all change how efficient your pedal strokes are. So getting a bike fit also makes you a more efficient rider generally, which means you can ride longer. Great, you got to go. That's no problem. You can take off, but thank you so much. It increases your efficiency, and which means you can ride longer without pain. But if you haven't got a bike fit and you're noticing some specific issues, talk to a local bike shop that is good at fit. And chances are the $100 level is an entry level. So that would be like the cleat fitting if you're going to lock in, or at least they're going to pay attention to your reach for your handlebars and maybe a seat. I'd say a $200 level typically involves changing the saddle. So, you know, the hip could be slightly forward, slightly back. And again, it's for clipping in with the shoes. And the $300 level is probably for triathletes to like really modify every little component of the bike. But the cool thing about a fit is that you'll get your metrics, and then a year later, you'll probably go get a fit check. Most shops just do it for free. And you'll see how your efficiency has actually increased and your flexibility might actually have increased. The trouble is if you're riding your bike and it doesn't fit you, you can actually do damage to your body. So it's actually a big concern to make sure the bike fits you if you're going to put a lot of miles on it, so that one, you're not damaging your body, And two, you can actually kind of build strength in certain parts of your body and make them very efficient, which could then increase your flexibility, which could limit the amount of strain happening on, the joints that shouldn't be strained when you're riding your bike. It's a long-winded way question, but my be-all and all is to talk to a shop in anywhere between 1 and 300, depending on the level, and then get a check about a year later and see how you've changed. Cool. Well, there's still a few of you left up there. So just a $300 bike fit shop. Well, I mean, is it FitWorks that's up in the North Shore? I do believe that's a really good triathlete one. I worked at Landry's Bicycles. We specialized in fit. We had a whole fit department. So there was a set of staff that were only doing bike fits, which is also amazing because they got trained up every year with specialized in Trek. So I recommend Landry's as well. But FitWorks is kind of like the performance-oriented shop up there. So they would know directly, like, really the specialties. And the cool thing about beginning a bike fit is you actually get a video camera on their special bike, and they'll make little minor adjustments on their, like, fully adjustable bike, not your bike, the adjustable bike. And they'll put little pins, reflective pins on your body, and they'll actually film it. And you can see the film. They'll kind of like drag some software over it to see what angles your knees are at, how much strain you're getting. It's really kind of fascinating technology. And I wasn't a believer in it until I got a fit. And then I changed my life. And it meant that I could ride 100 miles in a day and still walk the next day. When before on my heavy bike, I was not equipped for it. Mainly for road biking, mainly for distance, but you could also get a bike fit for mountain biking. It's just mountain bike is a little bit different because they're made to be whipped around a little bit more, a little more movement in the body. Whereas road biking and especially triathlons, you're really kind of locked into one position that you're maximizing. So it's a little bit of how far down that rabbit hole you really want to go. But yeah. But great. Cool. I'll stick around for a few more minutes, maybe just 1 or 2 more minutes, but if there are no more questions. But I'm happy to stick around as long as there are questions. Cool. Great. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, bike fit is awesome. I know it's an investment, and you say, why am I bothering after spending this much money already? But it is, with every pedal stroke after you've got a fit, you're just like, ooh, yeah, it just sinks in. And again, make the bike fit you. Try not to modify it the other way around because your body's more important. I'll tell you. Great. Cool. And again, I want to thank the Hamilton-Wenham Library. I want to thank the town and all the surrounding towns, wherever you're coming from. We're trying to get some online programming in. So check out massbike.org, not just for the practical stuff, but for the advocacy. There's a lot going on that we need some help on. So on a local level, and a regional and a statewide level. So I'm very encouraged that we've got some pretty good attendees. Great. Okay, with that, I'll let everybody continue their night. And thanks so much for sticking around.